A very, very warm welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Neal. I'm the chair of the Froebel Trust. And welcome to this second annual Froebel Trust lecture, and a particularly warm welcome to our speaker, John Carnochan, who joins us this evening. Welcome, John. Now, you may be wondering what links Froebel, a German educational reformer, the inventor of the kindergarten, and a distinguished former Scottish police officer, and what links the trust and its interest in early years to John's interest in the prevention of violence. But I think the affinities are actually much deeper than they might at first appear. For a start, both Froebel and John were men of action who have gravitated to reflection and to reform. So Froebel, long before he established his first kindergarten in Thuringia just over 200 years ago, played a major part in the tumultuous events that led to Germany freeing itself from Napoleonic rule. Froebel was a member of the Lützow Freikorps, one of the many societies or militias that fought for the independence of the German states as the tide of war turned against Bonaparte in 1813 and 1814. So don't imagine that Froebel was simply a retiring school teacher. He was a man of action. And in rather the same way, John has gravitated too from being a man of action to a man of reflection. John, in his 39 years with the Strathclyde Police, rose to be the Chief Superintendent, the Deputy Head of CID. And as an officer in the Strathclyde Police, developed a strong interest in the prevention of violence. He and a colleague established a prevention of violence unit in 2005, which focused on the causes of violence and has since been supported by the Scottish government, and the work has gone Scotland-wide. So there are links to men of action gravitating to reflection. And I think there are affinities too in the thinking of Froebel and John. If you read John's 2015 book on the prevention of violence, you will find that John is deeply concerned with the early years, with early intervention, with the integrity of people, with empathy and with humanity. And these are all principles that would absolutely resonate with Friedrich Froebel. Read Froebel's great work of 1826, Die Menschenziehung, the education of mankind, and you will find many of the same preoccupations as you find in John's work. You will find a preoccupation with the integrity of childhood. You will find a preoccupation with the realization of the self-realization through exploration, through play, through engagement with the natural world. So there are deep affinities, I think, between the works of John and Froebel. And it is those principles of Froebel that the Froebel Trust, which I chair, has been established to promote in the contemporary settings. So we strongly support teacher education. The Froebel Trust was established in 1892 by British supporters of Froebel's methods and approach, and one of its first actions was to establish a teacher training college, Froebel College, which exists now as one of the constituent colleges of the University of Roehampton. And the Trust continues to support teacher education to this day in partnership with early education. We are supporting universities both in the UK and overseas as centres of Froebelian practice and the dissemination of Froebelian principles. We are major funders of research, of original research, with over £1 million committed to research since 2016. There is a huge amount of activity supported by the Trust, of which this lecture is simply one manifestation, all dedicated to promoting Froebel's principles in the modern age. So there are strong links between the work that John has done on the prevention of violence and the principles that the Trust supports. And I'd now like to invite John to come up and talk to us. John, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It always bodes well when an audience applauds before you speak. Always good. I always had a thought in my head when I was working, and it was this, that if you find yourself to be the smartest person in the room, you should find another room. I'm very comfortable here tonight. We'll be fine. Thanks for coming along. Thank you so much for the invite. Once I was reassured, I have imposter syndrome, once I was reassured that indeed it did fit together, I was delighted, although a little worried to start with. It's strange being a police officer for 39 years and then finding myself speaking about early years. It was a gradual sort of move along. A few light bulb moments that I'll perhaps share with you. But mostly just a sort of a gradual thing is all we did. So what we'll do tonight is we'll do a short introduction. I'll be able to do a little philosophy because I quite like that. Some context, lots of evidence and research, because there is lots of evidence and research, a few personal reflections, and we'll conclude with some hope, because hope, I think, is hugely important, and we forget about that. So the introduction, it should include thank you for coming along. I know it's Tuesday night, and I think this is pie night in the Great British Bake Off. And I know it's always hugely popular, the pie night. So thank you. I'm sure we can thank Sky and all these recording devices for getting you out the house tonight. I decided just about half an hour ago to start with a quote that I didn't plan to do, which is always dangerous going off script this early. This is a quote from Albert Einstein, and it was in speaking to somebody earlier that made me think of this. He said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a fruitful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." So we'll start with that. So I think, too, I should tell you a few things. Some warnings. The first is, I'm not a health visitor. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a civil servant. I'm not an academic. That'll become apparent to you as this unfolds. I am disruptive. In a positive way, mostly. And I'm a grandfather. And you should never underestimate grandfathers. Our resilience or our cunning. Don't ever do it. Because age and treachery will always overcome youth and enthusiasm. Always. So what I'd like to do to start with is move this water, because I'm going to slide it so that it will fall. I'm going to ask you a question. I know you've probably been working all day or you've been busy all day, but this is an interactive sort of thing. So I want to ask you a question. It's a multiple choice question. And there's only two choices. So I'm presuming it's going to be pretty straightforward for you. What I'd like you to do is put your hand up if you're not a son or a daughter. Cool. You see, We are all that, and we always have been, but we've forgotten that. And it turns out, as I speak and ask this question all over the world, I'm always speaking to humans. Always. There are human social workers and human police officers and human doctors and human nurses and human criminals and human children, but we're all humans. But we've forgotten that. So I'd like to bring your whole self into the room. So I don't know your occupation, I don't know what you do, I don't know what your background is, but I know for certain you're all somebody's son or daughter. So that's a good place to start. So we'll start from there. Because you see, we're born connected, and we stay connected. From that first spike of oxytocin that mum gets when her baby's born, that's when it starts. That's the biology starting to say, we're ready to be loved, we're ready to be connected, we're ready to stay in touch, we're ready for a relationship, we're ready to be attached. That's what we do. But we seem to have forgotten that over the years. No mother ever lifted her baby up and her newborn and said, I'm going to make your life really difficult. Nobody ever did that. Nobody, ever. But there's a whole range of reasons around it makes it very, very difficult to do. When children in classrooms are accused of seeking attention, what they're actually doing is seeking connection. And most of the people that we have trouble with in our society, that society has trouble with, are disconnected. They're disconnected in many ways. And we have to remember that. So that human thing, we're working against ourselves if we don't do that. Because what we seem to have done over the past few decades is become in the thrall of business models and systems. And I am not a systems guy. We've come into that thrall where the value frame is usually money, reinforced by an audit frame to try and deliver on what's meant to be. We hit the target and miss the point. And it happens all the time. I mean, if you're unsure about this, think about when you're watching, if you watch TV, if you watch Long Lost Families, and some mum is reunited with her child she hasn't seen for 40 years, and I'm sitting at home as a homicide detective from Glasgow weeping like a child. And I don't even know who it is. When Andy Murray comes second at Wimbledon, and he's crying, and I'm crying with him, and he's getting £750,000 for coming second, and I don't like tennis, how does that work? It's because we can't help ourselves. We're programmed to do that. Babies are programmed to do that. Relationships are why we're top of the food chain. And yet, when we're employing people, these are some of the things that would be in the person spec and the job spec. We do that all the time. And there'll be lots of others. I mean, you can add any amount of things on that. Why is it we never have that? Why is it we never think it would be great to have a sense of humor? Because I can tell you, as a cop for 39 years, that was a real bonus. We need those things. Those are important. And it's interesting. In most organizations, the only department that has human in its title is human resources. Yeah, you get the irony too. It's there. And we've just forgotten about that. And not only have we forgotten about it, but we tend now to devalue the other stuff. If it was just that we were forgetting about that, that would be fine. But we're actually not just forgetting about these human things, we're actually devaluing them. We have some places where there are no-touch policies with children. No-touch policies? I mean, really? That's absurd. Someday we'll look back on that and think it's shameful. But that's what we do. So some context. As was said, I set up the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow a while back. It gets much talked about down here right now, and has been for the past couple of years. You know, everyone thinks there's a magic bullet, no pun intended with that, but there is some magic. There's no magic to this. When I was asked by the commissioner about, one of the commissioner's representatives about what would I do, I said I'd put community cops back in there and leave them in there so that they can establish a relationship with the community and get to know people. That would be a good start. Nothing very sexy about that, you know. Nothing very initiative, important about that, but that's the sort of thing we do. So, violence. If we think of violence like that iceberg, We always worked in the top part of it, the part we could see. We were great at that. Our detection rates for murders, because we say murder in Scotland rather than homicide, because we say murder much better. Our detection rates for murders were around 98%. We never had 100% because we were always investigating another murder. We were great at it, really good at it. But we didn't make a blind bit of difference to the size of that iceberg. We didn't shrink it at all. We just kept chipping away. And as we chipped away at the iceberg just bobbed up a little bit. We didn't do anything about it. So if we want to reduce violence, and by violence, I mean everything from bullying through to suicide. Suicide is self-directed violence, and it's often ignored. And in this country, and particularly in Scotland, we have horrific levels of suicide, particularly amongst young men, because I also think mostly violence is a man thing. And something else that I should lay out there, we don't learn how to be violent. We learn how not to be violent. That's why those early years for me are so important. Because in those early years, we learn to communicate, to negotiate, to compromise. We learn to establish relationships. And we find a whole range of other ways of coping with difficult situations. And if we don't have those, we're left with what we have. And that's often not that good. So if we want to shift that iceberg and shrink it, we need to talk about big things. And big things, like violence against women. We don't fix violence against women, you won't fix violence. Because we always speak about children and how important it is for children and how, I mean, we even have that absurd child poverty. Really? We need to see families. And if we value children, and I don't want to be controversial, but I'm not sure in this country that we actually like children. I think most of the time we tolerate them. We like our own children and often love our own children, and I agree with that. But certainly, in general, I think we tolerate them. We separate them from everywhere we go. We put them into school at 4.5 to get out of our way. We do all of that stuff. So until we actually switch that around and start to think in a different way and value children the same way, and then we'd start to value their parents and the role of parents. And it would be far better to do that. The other thing, of course, is my name is Scotland. I have a problem. Alcohol is a huge issue for us in terms of violence. One of the biggest drivers of violence is inequality. Inequality is a huge driver of violence across the world. The most unequal countries are the most violent. So these young disconnected men living in obvious inequality with little hope and nowhere going. There's an answer. Start to address some of those things and you'll start to address violence and where we are with it. The other thing that came on is with the early years. Back in 2008, I should say when we started doing this, Cam McCluskey and I set the VRU up. And the introduction, a detective. So I followed the evidence. So for a while, we were coming across pieces of evidence, and I started using the expression emerging evidence. And what I meant was I've just found out about it. And when I found out about adverse childhood experiences, when I found out about the importance of early years and those non-cognitive skills that are best acquired in those early years, I thought nobody else knew about this. If we know this, why is it that our nurseries and our staff in nurseries are paid the least and our universities are paid the most? Why is that? Because those are the people who build the brains before you can actually get to educate the brains. So why do we not value them just the same? So that was the first thing that came across for me. And so adverse childhood experiences, which you'll have heard around. We brought Vincent Felitti. It was a study of Felitti and Anda way back. And they work for Kaiser Permanente, which is an insurance company in America. So they're bean counters. They were working out how much is it going to cost to save our money here, you know? So it was really serious stuff because it was about money and insurance. And they're really not keen in giving a lot of that away. And what they were doing was they were looking, the cohort they had was 17,500. The stats are there. What you should note, though, is that they were mainly middle class because they had health insurance. So they're mainly middle class. So adverse childhood experiences is not an otherizing thing. It's not an otherizing thing. It's for everybody. And what they found was they were having a significant impact in later life. It was about, Felitti's work was about obesity. And he found that when some of his people were losing weight, they were putting weight on very quickly again. Why was that? And the things they had in common were adverse childhood experiences. They'd never come across this before. It was startling for them. So they went back and checked it again. And there's been more and more done around that. And Felitti talks about toxic stress in the early years and how damaging that can be. And there's lots of stress. Above the tree is about adverse childhood experiences, maternal depression. You can see them all there. But also poverty, discrimination, community disruption. Those are stressful. Those are stressors. They make a huge difference. Now, stress is not necessarily a bad thing. There's good stress. That, I'm stressed right now, but it's a healthy stress. It's a healthy stress. But if you're living every day in stress, it's not healthy. It's toxic. It becomes very, very difficult just even to function. So if you imagine a mum, about to be a mum, her principal responsibility is to create a safe environment for her baby. But if she's living in poverty, if she's living with an abusive partner, if she's suffering from depression or some other mental illness, she'll find it very difficult to create a safe environment for her baby. Her body will create cortisol, which will damage the baby before it's even born. And then when the baby's born into that environment, it's not an enriching environment for them. So they don't learn these other things. And then those are the children, when they go to nursery, that don't have many words and don't say much. Because vocabulary, as we know, is a measure of neglect. Those are the kids who don't play well with other kids. Those are the kids who become disconnected very quickly and not part of that particular gang. And then they go to primary school. And they go to primary school normally at 4.5 or 5, which is absurd, but I'll speak more about that later. But they go along, and we get them to sit in the corner and sit there, and we're going to assess you now, because it's really important. And those children become further detached because they don't sit down. They won't do that. And of course, what happens is, as they become further detached and further disconnected, they lose that opportunity to learn to read and write. And those are the things that give you the education. That's the keys. And then those kids will go to secondary school, and they'll be disconnected all the way along. And in secondary school, it won't get any better. In fact, in secondary school, something else happens to them. We issue them with hormones. And in many cases, we should actually hold some of them back. Because when we get into our adolescence, that's when we start to take risks. That's what we're meant to do. That's why we're taught with the food chain. But we make good decisions about ourselves. We can judge risk because we've had good early years. We understand how to negotiate. We understand how to compromise. We understand how to communicate. So we can make good decisions about ourselves. We can try alcohol and not become an alcoholic. So all of those things happen. And then what happens is those are the kids who, in the current climate, get excluded very quickly from school. And those are the people who keep the average life expectancy in lots of areas of our cities low. Those are the people who die early. Those are the people who, during their life, don't have good relationships, don't hold down jobs, but pull down services and become very expensive for us. Another reason why we should do it. So there's economic arguments, and they die early. That's that toxic stress. Toxic. And the impact on children. It's very like post-traumatic stress for our soldiers and sailors coming back from theatres of war suffer from that post-traumatic. It's very same for children. Exactly the same outcomes for them when they're there. One of the things we're trying to do in Scotland, we have an ACE-aware movement because we need a movement for this. So let me make a couple of things clear about ACEs. It's not a score to see what the threshold is and how many services you get. And I'm not asking you to tell me what your ACEs are, but we all have ACEs. Some persons can have one ACE and it can have a dramatic effect in their life because they have no buffering relationships around them. They have nobody to help them with it. Others can have 9 or 10 and be absolutely fine and get through it because they'll have good relationships around them. And that makes it hugely important. One of the things we're trying to encourage is the changing of a question The question of what's wrong with you, or why did you behave like that? And the question changes to what happened to you. And if you change that, what happened to you, it's an entirely different conversation. It's a conversation much more about prevention than anything else. And those are the ACEs. This was work that was done by Mark Bellis at Cardiff, who used to be at John Moore. And Mark is the focal point for the World Health Organization Violence Prevention Alliance in the UK. And these are just some of the stats. If you have 4 or more ACEs, you're 4 times more likely to be a high-risk drinker. You're 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated in your life. That's contemporary stuff. So Felitti is an American study. This is Wales now. In Scotland, we now have an ACEs hub run by Public Health to try and find out more about it. But adverse childhood experiences are not predictors of outcome. They're predictors of increased risk. They're the opportunity to change things, the opportunity to make things better, to see where we should be spending our money rather than building new jails, which is a waste of money. More prisons, you'll need more cops, you'll need more lawyers, and sorry, but if you have more lawyers, you'll need more BMW dealerships. There are really good lawyers around. When we started doing this, we discovered that violence was a public health issue. And so we found out who in Glasgow was the public health director. And it turned out it was a fellow called Harry Burns. So we went to Harry and said, Harry, what are you doing about violence? And he admitted he was doing absolutely nothing about it, which shocked him, because we were saying it's your responsibility. What do you want us to do? But Harry, at that time, before that, had been a cardiovascular surgeon. And Harry had been trying to work out why was it that some people recovered very quickly from his procedures. Within 5 or 6 weeks, they were back to where they were, and others were taking 7, 8, 10 weeks and not getting back. He was trying to work out how that might be. And so we had an affinity. Harry became chief medical officer. In his first year of office, his annual report included a section on violence, which we wrote. And Scotland adopted a public health model to look at violence and started to think about primary prevention and secondary prevention. And if you think about primary prevention, that means you need to think about early years. So we're an early years task force, and we did a whole range of things. Some good, some could have been a lot better, and still much to do, so we haven't fixed it. But Harry found out some work by Aaron Antonovsky. And what Antonovsky had done, Antonovsky had found a cohort of people who had either been born in the camps during the Holocaust or had been young children in the camps during the Holocaust. And he followed them up. And what he found was, as you would imagine, the overwhelming majority of those people didn't have good lives. They had poor relationships, poor mental health, poor physical health. They weren't good. But there was a small number who were absolutely fine. And so good old Aaron looked at them, because often we concentrate on the things that make us ill and not the things that make us better. You know, it's a health service, it's not an illness service. So we need to look at those. And what he found was, he called it a sense of coherence. And there's 3 elements to it. The first one is that your world is structured, predictable, and explicable. The second is that you have the internal resources to meet the demands that world might throw at you. And the third is the demands are seen as challenges and worthy of investment. Now think of those things, that sense of coherence. So think about it in terms of, you know, the headline, I nearly named the paper there. Anyway, the Daily Mail. If they had a headline that said, "Prison's so soft, these men would rather be in prison," when the headline should actually read, "Life is so bad, you're better off in the jail." Because when you're in prison, your world's explicable. It's structured. You have some way of coping every day with what's there. When you come out, homeless, hungry, alcohol, violence, loneliness. So why wouldn't you rather be in the jail? Think of a child who's living in poverty, who has an abusive father, a mum who's abused by the father, who perhaps drinks too much. And you don't know when you're at school if you're going home that night to be fed, if your bed's going to be clean, if the house is going to be clean, if your mum's going to be there. You don't know that. no sense of coherence. So for many teachers in schools, what I always say to teachers is, you may be the only consistent adult in a child's life, and the school may be the only safe place that's consistently safe for them, and you will have a huge impact on those children's lives, a huge impact, and we shouldn't underestimate it. So for that creation of health, comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful. And some personal reflection now that sort of links into that notion as well. When I was head of the CID, before I became deputy head of CID for the whole of Strathclyde, I was head of the CID in the east end of Glasgow. And we were averaging, I don't know, maybe 30 murders a year. I remember one weekend we had 4 murders in the weekend. Never very difficult to solve, always in the same areas. Always the same young men, usually involving a knife, all of the same stuff. That was the first trigger that was there. So I would be at home, asleep, 2 in the morning, thriving, quite comfortable. And then the phone would ring. And it would be the duty officer at Force Control who'd say, sorry to disturb you, sir, we have a murder in Barrowfield. And I'd go into the coping mode. In fact, I might be just coping, because I've just wakened up. And I start to ask questions and take a note of things. And say, right, okay, I will be there in half an hour. I have a shower, and I jump in the car, and I'm driving. And as I'm driving, I stay in the just coping. I might get back to coping. Because investigating murders it's a technical skill. That's what it is. It's a technical skill. You can acquire the technical skills to do it. So I get there, and as I arrive at London Road Police Office, I have to go through this great big gate that's controlled by the control room. But they know my car, so as I pull up, they press the button. And of course, what they've done as well is told everyone else, the boss is here. So as I'm parking my car in the back of the yard, the back door would open, and half a dozen people would come out. Maybe the night shift superintendent, forensic scientist, maybe a procurator fiscal, and they're all coming towards me. And they're all starting to tell me what's happened, what they want to do, what needs to be done. And we get into chaos. And the best way I dealt with that was, and this is just a tip I'll give you anyway, is completely disengage. So I just stop. And they'd all stop talking eventually. And I'd say, why don't you put the kettle on? Because whoever's deceased will still be deceased once we've had a cup of tea. And then we'd sit down and have a cup of tea and sort out the things that we had to do. Some children are living in chaos every day. And when we tell them they need to stick in and get good results so they can do well at school and when they leave school, they're trying to stick in and get through the day. They're not thinking about their future. They're thinking about today. They're thinking about tonight. And that's difficult. While we're in this thrall of business models, we always look for great big changes. You know, we ran a gangs program in the east end of Glasgow, and I see a couple of cops here tonight from Northampton who are doing it as well and doing a great job with it, taking it to a new level. It's called a Civ project. And all we did really was say to people in gangs, stop doing that. We've had enough. And if you stop doing that, we'll give you a hand to do something else. And do you know what? It works. It works. Turns out it works in Northants as well. Of course, you really need good people to do it. People and attitudes, no strategies and plans and paradigms and models. People, they make the difference. But I remember being interviewed by a lady from Radio 4. And I'm not really a Radio 4 guy, I'm sorry. But so we're in my office in Glasgow. And we had reduced gang-related violence by 85%. We had reduced 9 carrying by 90-something%. We had made a huge impact on it. But she said, first thing she said was, I have trouble with your accent. So I said, well, listen, this is my office. This is Glasgow. I live here. I don't have an accent. And then it sort of went on from there. She said, well, I see some of these young men are still offending. I said, yeah, absolutely. Of course they are. But last year they were stabbing each other and dying. This year they're getting drunk and falling down. That's harm reduction. It's not the ideal, but it's harm reduction. It's made it a little bit better. So that notion that Tolstoy speaks about when he says history has an infinitely large number of infinitesimally small actions, it's hugely important. It'll not be that drop by 80% or 90%. It will just be those little indiscernible changes, and you'll find out, oh, how did we arrive here? And we need to be okay with that. And don't be driven by an audit that demands something entirely different. My mantra is start where you are and do what you can. Don't ask for somebody else to do it. You do it. What can you do? Then do it. It might not be a huge thing, might not be a big thing, but get it done. It's your head in the pillow. And I like him, Tank Man. You remember that Tiananmen Square in the 80s? What could I do? That's wrong, the tank's in the square. What will I do? I know, I'll stand in front of the tank. And he did. And when the tank tried to get around him, he just moved to the side, then moved to the side. He eventually climbed on top of the tank and spoke to the human inside it. And it went viral. The coolest thing for me is he's got 2 bags of shopping with him. You notice that? That's pretty cool. I reckon his wife's sitting in a flat somewhere saying, he left here half an hour ago to go to the shops. And I wonder where he is. It's there. So as we go forward and we're thinking about, this is really, for me, what life's about. I mean, when Steve Jobs was at school, I bet he never said to anybody, when I grow up, I'm going to build iPods. I bet he didn't do that. Maybe he did, right enough, he might have, but I doubt it. We don't know. The way we're doing things now, children at school today could have 2 careers of 30 years and be fine. We're making them work forever. We're the generation that's done it to them. They're going to be working for a long time. They'll be doing things that we haven't even thought of yet, building things that haven't been invented yet. How do you train them for that? Well, you train them for that by being good humans. Because relationships will matter, influence will matter, communication will matter, how they get on with each other will matter. Not the technical stuff. That's fine. We'll need that. And to be clear, I mean, if something happened to me and I turned up at an A&E, I want the doctor who meets me, I want her to be technically proficient. I don't just want a cuddle, you know? But what I want is the balance between the two redressed a little bit. That's important. So when these kids, we start talking about that, it's hugely important. I've got a couple of quotes from US presidents, luckily enough, I think it's the 6th and the 32nd. We can't always build a future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future. It's a bit like, when we were doing this, it occurred to me, if you think about drugs, we've had a war on drugs, and we've done nothing at all. We've not made any difference. When I was in the drug squad, drugs are as cheap now as they were when I was in the drug squad in the early 90s. We're an island. We've done nothing with it, because 99% of our effort goes into that supply chain. We've done nothing about the demand. What are we doing about that? Well, I'll tell you what we're doing about it. Good early years is doing something about it. Because kids will make good decisions about themselves, and they'll not take drugs, and you'll start to reduce the demand. They'll be able to resist these other things. And it's important we think about that. And this is how I got to that quote from Albert Einstein, when he was talking about, that logic will take you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere. If the right side of our brain is the one that develops first, and it is, and play is learning, then why are we not doing more of that? We're stuck. And that's fine, but we just need to keep pushing on this. This is not going to be a revolution. This is about each one of us pushing a little further. Change begins at an individual level. You know, governments are not particularly good at doing lots of things, well, even less nowadays. But they make laws and they spend money, and they're not particularly keen in spending the money. So that's about it. So you ain't going to legislate for this. If you could legislate, remember we brought in antisocial behavior. We made antisocial behavior illegal. That worked. But I mean, that was all they could do, because they couldn't do anything else. So we need to think a bit more and be a bit smarter about it. That 12% of countries in the world that send their kids to school between 4 and 5 are all ex-Commonwealth countries, for the most part. There's something in that. We need to get over that. In Scotland, we've started another movement. We're great and stuff. We're a rebellious bunch. Upstart. And what Upstart is about starting school at 7 and having formal kindergarten up until then, till children can learn to play. And when they go to school, blossom and grow into the fabulous adults they'll be and help us with the future that we've just about not done very well with. And some of the other things that are important: hope, kindness. I live near Lanark. I was reflecting earlier, my wife and I took our granddaughter swimming up to New Lanark. New Lanark's a World Heritage Centre. Robert Owen's mill was there, and Robert Owen got a date. 1816, he set up a nursery school. And one of the things he said was, he stressed unceasing kindness in tone, word, and action to all children, without exception. There you go. Kindness. That's another one of those soft things, like compassion. Too soft. Really? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. The kids who need love the most are usually the hardest to love. We need to work hard at it. And hope changes everything. And I like this Václav Havel quote about hope. It just needs to feel it's the right thing to do. Of course it does. This is a guy. His name's Paul Brannigan. We were running a gangs program that I was speaking about earlier, and I was contacted via someone else by a writer, Paul Laverty, who was writing a screenplay about violence in early years, and he wanted to speak to us about it. So he came along, a really nice guy. And we introduced him to Paul Laverty. Paul Brannigan. Now, Paul Laverty, the writer, works for Ken Loach. Daniel Blake, he wrote that. He's written most of his stuff. He wrote a movie called The Angel's Share. If you haven't seen it, get it. It's about early years, and it's about violence, and it makes sense. Paul Brannigan won a BAFTA, because what happened was, when we took Paul, the writer, out to the East End of Glasgow, he met Paul, because Paul was working for us, coaching some of the guys in gangs that had been in gangs playing football. And he met him, and he was impressed by him, and he said, why don't you come down to London, meet Ken Loach, and read for this part? So he did, and he got the part, and he won a BAFTA. And he sent me a text from Cannes saying, I'm at the Cannes Film Festival, big man. And I sent a text back saying, thanks, but I'm not really interested. And then he went on to, his next film was with Scarlett Johansson. Didn't mean anything to me either. Paul was a methadone baby. All Paul knew in his early life was violence, nothing else. From his mother, his father, his uncles, his brother, that's all he knew. Paul was serving a 7-year sentence in a young offenders institution for gang-related violence with a firearm. And a prison officer said to him, Paul, you're going to be here for a while. Why don't you get interested in something? What are you interested in? He said, football. Right. Get into the football. So he started playing football, getting fit. And he said, now that you're doing that, why don't you start doing some work and get a certificate for coaching? So when you leave here, you can do something. Paul didn't want to do that, because Paul could barely read or write. Paul had been excluded from school. He was otherized. He was disconnected. He was one of those kids. But the prison officer knew that. So he started giving him newspapers and a pen and a notepad, a dictionary, and helped him with stuff. And Paul did okay. In fact, Paul was able to go to London and read the script for Ken Loach and get a part and get a BAFTA. Now, when the prison officer started doing that, he didn't say to Paul, listen, if you learn to read and write, you'll get a BAFTA, and you'll probably get to snog Scarlett Johansson one day. He didn't do that. He just started where he was and did what he could. And he hoped that the right thing would come out of it. And it did. But Paul's still a work in progress, and lots of things to do, but it's a hope. This is the 6th President of the United States, I think, Quincy Adams. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you're a leader. I would take leader out there. You're a teacher. Really? You're a teacher. That's what you're doing. And it is, for me, the closest thing to magic without actually being magic. It makes such a difference. In Scotland, I'm retired now and I only do the things that interest me. And one of the things that really interests me right now is children in care and how we have done them wrong for a long, long time. And we're about to change that in big ways. 2% of the general population in Scotland are care experienced. Over 50%, almost 60% of our prison population are care experienced. We don't have the data for homelessness or drugs deaths or suicides, but I'm sure it will reflect it just the same. So we need to do something about that. And I remember I took along, I'm an advisor to the STV Children's Appeal, and we took along Sir Tom Hunter, Sir Harry Burns, Sir Ian Wood, philanthropists, to meet some care experienced people. And one of the young women there, Ashley Cameron, who's just completed her master's, has had a horrible childhood. And she said, "You took me from my family and gave me a service when what I actually needed was love." Now, it's difficult and it's hard to hear those things, but we should be trying to do it. We should be making the best of it. And if there are some teachers in here today, and I'm sure there will be, I always like to say and finish with this notion. And my wife was a teacher. Lots of kids will bring in cards and say to the teacher, "Thanks very much, I got the necessary A's, so I'm going to do medicine, and I'm going to do law, and I'm going to be an architect, and I'm going to do criminology or whatever." There's lots of kids who won't bring in cards, but they'll be as good as they can be. They'll be in good relationships. They won't be addicts. They won't be in prison. They'll be doing the best they can because a teacher took an interest in them. A teacher was there at the right time to do something. A consistent adult in a safe place did that. So, on behalf of all those children, thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
John, thank you hugely for that. I wish I had had that passion and eloquence at my disposal when I was trying to persuade the Home Office to spend more money on early interventions and prevention. That was just a fantastic account. Now, perhaps I can invite John and our discussants to come and join us at the front. And I will do some introductions. So I will now just do a few introductions, though I suspect they need few introductions to many of you. Sitting next to John is Jackie Cousins, who has been a passionate advocate for children and families. Teacher, lecturer, you name it, Jackie has done it. Sitting next to Jackie is Bernadette Duffy, who was the head of the Thomas Coram Centre in Camden, and is, I think, a serial member of government working groups, the Foundation Years Framework, and so on. Sitting next to Bernadette is, who needs no introduction, is Tina Bruce, who I think it would be fair to say Tina is the doyenne of early childhood studies and Froebelianism in the UK, visiting professor at the University of Roehampton and one of Routledge's women educationalists, a fantastic advocate of Froebel and his principles. And then on the extreme left, or left as we look at it anyway, is Jane Winnett, Froebel Trust trustee, but also the head of two Edinburgh schools, one of the founders of the Edinburgh Froebel network, moving spirit behind much of the Froebel education teacher training in Scotland, and the moving force behind the new MSc at the University of Edinburgh. So a very distinguished panel. I'm now going to invite each of them to give a quick response to what John has said. If you wouldn't mind just picking up the microphones, I've been told, and holding it when you give your response.
Do I have to press anything?
No, I think you just speak into
really?
it,
I just
Jackie.
pick it up. I'm an absolute champion at recording anything that is technological, but
Jackie,
I will do my very best.
Over to you.
John, the first thing I pick up is absolutely the key is in the relationships, and that is the biggest connection that I can see between what you have done, what you have said today, and the Froebelian movement. The key is in the relationships, and within the Froebelian movement, we were encouraged right from the very beginning as the grown-ups in the lives of these children, particularly the most disadvantaged. And I was a foundling, I was a child in care, I was all those things that you've talked about today, with an absolutely amazing mother and a father who disappeared. But I had those wonderful Froebelian people who actually gave me direction, inspiration, allowed me to play, to explore, to concentrate, to have compassion for the other children, for animals, for things that were growing, to be a human being. And I think that's the biggest connection that I've seen between John, thank God for you, John, and all the other police in Glasgow who have actually sown the seeds for so many young men and women too, who didn't actually recognize any good in themselves at first, but they found the gifts that they were born with. And it's those grown-up people, like all of us, who work with young children particularly. We can't understand why we've been marginalized in the past. And other people haven't seen that the foundations are at the beginning and the seeds are sown in the ground, not up there when they're getting ready to do something big at university, but right at the very beginning. We can't understand why we've been marginalized and neglected, but we're on the move. We're bringing about change, slowly but surely, and it starts in here, in our hearts. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Bernadette.
John, I found many connections between your presentation and Froebelian philosophy and practice, so I wouldn't be worried, as you said in the beginning, that there weren't connections. Thank you so much. I know I've got a carrying voice, but it can't carry quite that far. So I think the thing that struck me in particularly was the connections between your views and Froebel's absolute emphasis on the importance of early childhood and the need to protect and nurture each and every child as an individual. And the importance of that, not only in the here and now, in giving them the best childhood we possibly can now, but also, as you very eloquently pointed out, the impact on their later lives, particularly if they don't have those key early childhood experiences. Froebel himself, of course, knew about the loss of warm relationships, and that very much influenced his thinking and placed that in the importance in his own work. I remember back when Tina and I were working on the early years foundation framework for England, and the battle there was to get the phrase loving relationships in as one of the aspects that was absolutely fundamental for young children. And that came very much, obviously, from our Froebelian backgrounds. I think from John's presentation, the desire for the best childhood for each child. Also, what came across to me was knowing and understanding the circumstances that affect children and families and the situations they find themselves. Not assuming, not going in and thinking, I know what's happening, but actually taking the time to observe, to reflect, to understand, and then to intervene and offer the support. I think as well, what I would extend on that is from Froebelian principle is as well as the respect for parents and obviously carers, and recognising and valuing their role, even when families are in incredibly difficult circumstances. All parents, as John said, want the best for their children. But the importance between harmony and between home and school, having those good relationships between the home and the school or the setting, and each partner in the part of the person in the child's life, respecting and valuing the expertise and contribution of the others. Parents having that amazing expertise and expert knowledge on their own child, more than a practitioner will ever get. But equally, practitioners having a really valuable expertise in how children learn and develop, and having had that experience of coming across children at various stages, and throughout their experience. I think the importance of, from Froebel, of us learning together, the child, the parent, and the practitioner, and seeing it as a learning community. From my background, John touched on it about play and imagination. I would also want to emphasize for Froebel the importance of creativity. The idea that if you're a creative individual, if you have that ability to be curious, to want to understand more about the world around you, to want to take risks, to try things out, to experiment, those are the sorts of characteristics that mean you will have the resources to deal with the challenges life throws at you. As was said, we don't know the future that the children are facing, but we do know that they're creative, they're resilient, they're going to have the best chance of being able to cope with that. And finally, I would say the importance of valuing practitioners working with young children. And John made that very clear, and Froebel, clearly that was so important to him, particularly for women, and the workforce is predominantly women in early years, really valuing and appreciating and understanding that if we want the best for our very youngest children, then we need to invest in the workforce and make sure that they have the very best.
Bernadette, thank you very, very much. Tina, on to you.
I thought it might be useful just to go back to our Froebelian roots and to look at something that Froebel said in his book, The Education of Humanity, the translation, as Mark said, mankind, it's humanity. He said, behind each fault lies, in origin, a good quality which has been perverted and crushed, a good aspiration which has been repressed or misunderstood. Therefore, the only infallible way of eradicating every defect is to try first to find out and then to encourage and direct the original good tendency underlying it. The fault will eventually disappear, although it may involve painful struggle. Not, however, against innate evil, but against habit. The effort will be successful because people will always choose the right thing rather than the wrong. For me, to hear John talking about the way young children are seeking connection and how some come to feel disconnected chimed very deeply with that quotation. And the fact that he wants to ask, what happened to you? Start where you are, John said, and do what you can. Well, Froebel believed we should begin where the learner is, not where we want them to be. I just feel so inspired to hear John talk about teachers, practitioners, in the way that he did. People who are trained to work with the family, to help children play and learn, to give kindness to every child, and to help children aspire to do more and to be good as they can be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Jane.
It's always good to be last, especially when you don't know what the other panelists are going to say. I work with children and families on a daily basis, and I work with families in all different situations, and I cannot underestimate the respect I have for the practitioners that I work with, who greet those children and work with families every day. And I think whatever we can do within a Froebelian approach to support practitioners to help children and families is what we should be doing. And one of the ways that I think we can do that is really looking at children's play, because I believe that children's play gives them a sense of control and helps them to make sense of the experiences that they've had. So the more that we can do to help practitioners to understand children's play and to help parents to understand children's play, the better I think it will be for them. So I would like to make a plea for more research and more practice development on children's play with experienced practitioners and people who can really help.
Jane, thank you very much. John, I think we should give you the opportunity to respond to what some of our panellists have said.
I want another row. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I get hugely frustrated by research and academics where it never lands. I was once called by a professor in Glasgow the so what guy, because we've got this fabulous bit of research that says this, this, and this, and that's so what. So how's that going to land? What does that mean for me? How is that going to change the world? And if it's not landing, then it's an indulgence. And I mean, there should be research for research's sake. Absolutely, I don't mind that at all. But I think there's things that we really need to be paying attention to right now that we could be doing something about. And I think the challenge is that when we started, I thought people would do the right thing simply because it was the right thing. I was incredibly naive. People need other reasons to do it. They're motivated by different things. And often ideology overcomes evidence. And that becomes a barrier to that. And so I think what needs to happen for change is that we change from the bottom up. It's an individual thing. Change begins at an individual level, and then we start to do it from in here is where it happens. And then and when you leave here, don't just speak to your professional colleagues. Speak to your brothers and your sisters and your aunts and your uncles and your friends and a taxi driver or whoever it is you meet, and speak about these things. Start the conversation, make it happen. And it will take a decade or so. It will take a while. But we need to start the conversations. And we need critical friends who can speak uncomfortable truths to start to do it. And it's there. But the refreshing thing for me was that I said I'm not an academic. I'm an interested observer. I was someone who noticed that I was telling someone that I'd locked up their 17-year-old son for murder. And then I was speaking to the parents of the 17-year-old boy that he'd killed, usually 2 streets away, with the same background and the same life, and the look in their face was the same, because one was going to visit in Berlin and the other one was going to a graveside, and it was just random. We had to change that. And this is how we start to change it. And it wasn't easy, and it's not easy, and we have a while to go, and we're not fixed. But the journey's, you can't become unaware. You cannot become unaware. So that notion of starting to understand better where we are with that. And Police Scotland have now appointed a Deputy Chief Constable, Malcolm Graham, whose responsibility is public health and how it works. And Harry Burns and I met with him already and speak with him. And they're making every police officer in Scotland and every staff member ACE aware. There was a great tweet last week at Kilmarnock Police Office, and they had a representation up one of these things that, the art that's done at a conference about adverse childhood experiences, and it's framed and it's behind the public desk, so when people come in they see it. When we ask cops, what do you think about that? How do you? Because cops are mums and dads and brothers and sisters. So how would you like that happening to yours? So that's the change that needs to happen. It will take time. So I was reassured. Thank you. I'm sure you've been very mannerly because I've travelled down from Scotland. But I'm glad that it made sense. For me, it's about landing it. It's about the so what. So let's land it and see the difference. And I think the other thing too is about the workforce. I will say that if women can lead, men can nurture. I've spoken many times, Mr. Sullivan over there, about getting men into early years. I remember taking my youngest daughter years ago to a nursery, and they said, "Oh, you babysitting today?" I said, "No, I'm actually fathering." So we need to get over that. Men have got a responsibility for that. But we need to start and encourage much more men to do it. It's a difficult thing, but we need to start to do it. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Huge sense, though. I am quite relieved that the chair of our research committee was not here to hear your opening. Now, I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions or statements. And I think we've got a roving mic. Yes, there is Victoria with a roving mic. So who would like to... And there's Valeria with another roving mic. So who would like to ask a question, make a statement?
I no longer have power of arrest.
Ah, there we go.
Hi.
Perhaps you say who you are?
Hello. Yeah. My name is Sandra. I'm a PhD student, soon to submit, and I'm funded by the Froebel Trust. I just want to make a statement that what you said today I found very relevant to many other situations. My thesis looks into refugee children's play and their childhoods in Lebanon. And when I was doing fieldwork, it was quite difficult for me to see that this was happening in front of me. Like, children were completely disconnected, and there was a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination, and such a huge, like there are 1.5 million refugees. Half of the children don't go to school, so they can't build these connections. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I just wanted to say that, like, it really connected with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And John or the panel, would you like to respond to what Sandra had to say?
I could actually respond wearing my war child hat, I could respond to that. It's absolutely magical how those children who have been through so much trauma, so much absolute dreadful things that they've witnessed, that they've been part of, and feel totally lost and disconnected at the beginnings, how very quickly they can actually, through the adults who are with them, be guided into finding themselves again as real little human beings, not necessarily talking, not necessarily doing any of those things, but exploring around them. Art, music, just being allowed to be and be given that time to heal themselves is the starting point for them. And when they move on to adolescence, to me, it's been absolutely magical to see how the seeds that were sown by those people in our camps have reached a fruition, and they've been able to take themselves and their own ambitions for life, enthusiasms for life, much further. Take heart.
Other questions? Yes, there's a question here.
Thank you. Cheryl Adams, I'm the Chief Executive of the Institute of Health Visiting. John, I'm a bit of a John groupie, if I'm honest. Been following your great words for many years now. Obviously, we've got a huge problem with knife crime, which seems to be beginning to spew out of London, unfortunately. Is anybody in government listening to you on what you've been doing in Scotland? We've just lost a third of the health visiting workforce, so one would think probably not. Just wondering what we can do to connect Scotland's thinking and action to England's, perhaps, lack of understanding still about action politically with the early years.
Theresa May was Home Secretary and visited the Violence Reduction Unit 8 years ago. Karen and I were members of the task force that helped write a strategy for gangs 8 years ago. It's difficult. There are really good things happening. The stuff in Northants that Darryl and his team are doing with serve as a beacon, and that'll start to change. It's a slow burn. There's the Divert programme, which was a young inspector, a young sergeant who started that in London, starts to do it. There's good stuff. But But it's hard. It's that ideology and evidence. And it's short-termism. You know, longer prison sentences, you'll have more jails, you won't have less crime. You'll just, you know, if you've turned the prison system into a business, then of course you need more customers in your business. That makes sense. And that's what's happening. So I stay in touch with lots of people down here and help where I can. But as for that coordinated stuff that comes from either the Mayor's office or from, everybody knows what needs to be done. Everybody knows what needs to be there. It's straightforward, simple stuff. And it needs to be about building relationships. And that's why I said, you know, community cops and campus police officers in schools, that's where it starts, where you can build relationships of trust so that when you are talking about stop search, then you are talking about trust. And it's not a war, it's not a them and us. And I think media has a big role to play in it. I spoke tail end of last year at Damalola Taylor Trust, and I said there, if you read the press, you know, not every young black man in London carries a knife, for goodness sake, or is a member of a gang or in county lines, and that's a tiny percentage. But that's what we talk about, and we need to get past. That's about inequality. That's what that's about. So it's not, I don't think it's looking in, for instance, I don't think it's a race thing. You play that card and I think you're missing the point. We had, in the East End of Glasgow, where we had our gangs, and we had about 800 young men involved in gangs in the East End of Glasgow, involved in recreational violence. We had knife crime that was 3.5 times, 3.5 times more higher than it was in anywhere else in Europe. It was 5.3, the murder rate per 100,000. In England and Wales, it was 1. Not one of those young guys in gangs were all white Scots. But all the things they had in common with the young men that are seen down here is they had no hope. They were out of school. There was inequality. There was no chance. They were discriminated against because of their poverty. That's where it came from. And one of the biggest changes that we made was in Glasgow schools, where they reduced exclusions by 85%. That's what affected the gangs. Where here, it's working the opposite way around. If you bring our stats down, you're going out. You need to go somewhere. So I wish I could say to you, it's there. There are little bits that are really happening that's really good that I look down. It's there. Lambeth are doing really good stuff. As I said, the stuff that's happening in Northants will catch on with that, the divert thing. But as for expecting other people to do it, forget it. It starts at the bottom and goes up. That's where it starts. Good people. Start where you are and do what you can.
Sue, would you like to wait for the microphone?
Thank you. I'm Sue Robson. I'm a trustee of the Froebel Trust, and it's very much directed at you. We heard Mark talk about the significant investment as trustees that we make in research, and I don't mean to try to put you on the spot, but I think it follows on from what you've just been saying. Where do you think we should be directing some of our funding in terms of research? What do you think our priorities should be?
Well, I think we're in the stage where I remember when we started, Can and I had, and my colleagues, forensic psychologists, we had someone came along because they thought we had a budget. So you always attract people when you think you've got a budget, that's the first thing. And they said, knife crime's really high, we need to work out why people are carrying knives. And I said, well, no, we don't. We know enough to be getting on and doing something about it right now. And I think there's lots of stuff that we can be getting on with right now. How much more do we need to know that play, that going to school too early, that all of these things are hugely important. The relationships between families and caregivers, hugely important. And that's one of the things in Scotland. If we're talking public health and want to shift the biggest amount, do stuff and fix the care system. If we do stuff with that, we'll make a huge difference in what's happening. 2% of the population, 50% of the prison population. If you want to look at how all this plays out, look at the care system. Because we've mixed it up with a child protection system and a care system. We protect the child and we take the child away from the family. And when we've spoken to thousands of care experienced kids, thousands of them, and they all say the same thing. Why did you take me away from my family? Why did you do that? They loved me. All of the young men that we met in Pullman, our young offenders, if you read their history, like Paul Brannigan I spoke about, Paul had a terrible life. Paul has got nothing but love for his mother. Nothing but love for her. He wouldn't say anything else. And that's the way it should be. So we need to work on that. So as far as research goes, I'm not sure. I wish I knew. There'll be specific parts like that about refugees that are here right now that's really important, because it's new for us and we need to understand that better. But I think we know enough to be doing lots and lots of things. I really do.
Other questions or statements from the floor? There, we have one at the back.
Hi, my name's David. I'm a social worker in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. Oh, okay, there we go. Can you hear me now? Great. My question is relatively open for anyone on the panel. I'm just wondering what your views are on the increase in the medicating of children, especially in response to adverse childhood experiences, really, behavioural problems, attention problems, and then when they get a bit older, antidepressants, and the role that medication might have in supporting children and young people, but also how to move away from using it as a crutch and integrating it with a more relationship-based approach.
That's an easy question.
Sorry.
Who would like to pick that one up on the panel?
I think we perhaps are too quick to look to medicalise what a normal childhood experience is. And we take a view that if a child is experiencing difficulties or behaviour, there must be something wrong with them. And we need to give them the medicine to fix what's wrong with them. I think we need to look in a much more Froebelian way about the wider context a child is in. A bit as you were saying, John, what's going on within the family? How is the family and the setting and or the school relating to each other? How are all the people in the child's life? Children can often end up being the scapegoat for something that's actually not to do with them, but to do with a much wider context. So I think it's important we come back to looking at what's going on for the child, as was said before, to understand for them, not what went wrong, what's going wrong for you, but what's happening, as you said. So to really invest our time in listening to and talking to the child and find out what's happening to them. I think the risk is with medication is it will suppress the child enough to keep them in the classroom, but they will not be learning, they will not be enjoying, they will not be making connections with others. So I would much prefer to give whatever resource we can into the really understanding the child, working effectively as practitioners and parents to support that child and ensure their well-being.
Perhaps the notion of social prescribing, the notion of one of the things that's emerging with our care review is that idea of maintaining the family, because the family will have issues. You know, mum's got problems and dad will have problems, but the reason we take the child away is because that's easier. Because we can take the child away because to deal with the whole family holistically requires the collaboration and coordination of different services who are all different gangs. Those are the gangs that causes the issue. And so it becomes very difficult. But if you dream the dream for a moment, which is always worthwhile, and you say, well, Mrs. A turns up at her GP and she's pregnant. And the doctor says, fab, and there's some things we'll have to do and clinical things, but also says, I remember you've got 2 other kids and they're on the at-risk register. And I know your husband can be violent sometimes and he has a problem with alcohol. And I know that you've had some problems with depression before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to prescribe you Jane. And Jane's going to be with you. And Jane's a generic social worker. The way generic social workers were in the late 70s and early 80s that was envisaged by everyone. And Jane will establish a relationship and stay with you. And sort out the issues in the family that are there and help you with them. It might be a new washing machine. It might be something entirely different. It might be an intervention. It might be a prescription. And they'll be with you. The Netherlands do it. 1 family, 1 plan. And some of these Janes can be with a family for 2 years or 3 years. Sometimes it's just for 6 months. But it's about, the point of it is, we're keeping the family together. At the heart of that as well, of course, will be, protection of the child. We're not going to, that's still there, but it won't be that take the child away, because we take them away because it's easier to do. But I think, the big answer is better relationships, so you'll have better mental health. Most of the people I see on the streets in London and in the streets in Glasgow or Edinburgh are disconnected and mentally ill because there's nothing, I think, was it Mother Teresa said, there's nothing worse in the world than to be nothing to no one. And that, for lots of people, that connection is huge. And I know, I don't mean it to sound it's that simple. It's not, because the job you guys do every day of the week is, and take the trouble home in your head and think about it at the weekend. But for me, social prescribing, before we get to the other stuff, we medicalise things too quickly.
I think we've had a lot of success with the Family Nurse Partnership in Scotland, and that's really been through the health visiting service. And we have very good joined-up working relationships with health visitors for all children below 5. But certainly I'm seeing real success with that, where we've had families, care-experienced mothers who have been well supported by the health visitors through the health.
And an interesting thing about the Family Nurse Partnership, or Nurse-Family Partnership, David Olds is the man he's an American who established it and protects the fidelity of the programme very, very rigorously. I've met him a couple of times. David got his idea for that on a visit to the UK 30-something years ago, when he met health visitors and thought, that's a good idea. And then he took it away, and then he came back 25 years later and sold us it, and we bought it. And the question to ask yourself is that a Family Nurse Partnership health visitor may have 10 in her caseload, where a health visitor may have 220 in her caseload. Tell me what you think the reason is. Is it the model? Is it the resource? And it's back to that. People need something, they want something that's innovative and clever and hasn't been done before. Innovation's good, effective's even better. So, health visiting works. It works. Do it. Do it.
Now, I've got half an eye on the time because we have to network at 8:15. That's what the programme tells us. So I think we've got time for one more question or statement. Yes. The microphone is on its way.
Thank you. I wanted to say a big thank you for a lecture and for all your reflections. It was very, very interesting connection. I'm very happy to hear that you're doing what you're doing. I'm very appreciate. So my question, so I know how important for children from dysfunctional families to get the psychological support. I'm just wondering how accessible it is, like in the proportion or in percentage, how many psychologists or psychotherapists are working with the families. Because, for example, based on Jones Bowlby's attachment theory, I know how important it is to work with these children, and it's actually years of deep work of the psychotherapy. Otherwise, they're gonna really struggle in a later life, and they will have at them deep unconscious problems, and then actually they will. They'll have big problems if they're not going to solve them as soon as possible. Maybe it's not going to work with children because they're little. It's maybe via play or something else. But with teenagers, for example, if they really struggle, how are you going to solve all these deep problems they have? Thank you.
The issue of resource and CAMS, it depends on the local authority that you live in Scotland, how quickly you'll get an appointment with your CAMS, your child and adolescent mental health team. If it's in Glasgow, it will be a long time. And it would need to be really quite challenging. In other places, it might be a little shorter and a little quicker. But as always, there aren't enough. There just aren't enough. And I think one of the things that I should have said when I was talking about that social prescribing is the big attraction for me about that notion of social prescribing is we look on the family as assets and not deficits. And say, what do you have here that you've got that's good? Well, I've got an aunt who lives around the corner. I've got an uncle that's there. I'm very good at this. And we start to build that around that family. So in terms of numbers, I really don't know. We've done, in the Violence Reduction Unit, from the very outset, worked quite a lot with Suzanne Zedijk, who's an early years developmental psychologist at Dundee and did a lot of work. And she established Connected Baby, and you know, her website's really good and far more technical about being able to answer your question probably better than I can. The bottom line is there's not enough. There just isn't enough. I mean, that's the bottom line of it.
Cool. Well, we must bring the formal proceedings to an end. Before we do, I would like to say a few thank yous. I first of all like to thank the team at the Trust itself, Victoria, Oksana, Deborah and Sasha, without whom this event would simply not happen. So, huge thanks to the team, and Valeria, of course. But fantastic, huge thanks to our panel, Jane, Tina, Bernadette and Jackie, for some really insightful interventions. Thank you to them. And above all, of course, thank you to you, John, for coming down all the way from Scotland to join us, and for a fascinating, passionate lecture, which really does give a ringing endorsement for the importance of relationships, the importance of the role of practitioners in those early years, and above all, the importance of action, of taking action. So, John, thank you very much.